Of the Committee on Government Operations, and we are here today to discuss Docket 0130. It's a petition for a special law regarding an act authorizing the City of Boston to offer early voting in municipal elections. This home rule petition proposes that the City of Boston Board of Election Commissioners offer early voting for biennial municipal elections beginning in 2019 for any qualified voter. It also proposes that the Board of Election Commissioners establish a process for early voting locations, dates, staffing, and a process for applying for, receiving, separating, compiling, recording, and securing early voter ballots. Voting sites shall be accessible to persons with disabilities, and regulations to implement this act and should be consistent with Section 25B of Chapter 54 of the Mass General Laws. I'd like to note that this hearing is being streamlined on Boston City Council TV online and is being recorded and will be broadcast at a later date on Comcast Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, and Verizon Channel 1964. I'll now turn it over to the lead sponsors, my colleague, City Councilor Josh Zakem, and also City Councilor Kim Janey, and we've also been joined by our colleague, City Councilor Ed Flynn, for opening remarks, and then we'll get into it with the administration, and then we have other panel guests as well as members of the public who wish to testify can do so at that time. Chair recognizes the lead sponsor, Councilor Josh Zakem. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank a good colleague, Councilor Janey, for her co-sponsorship and leadership on this issue since long before she joined the Boston City Council, and our colleagues for their support of this, and of course to our election commissioners and the department here in the City of Boston. I want to thank you for the work you do on this every day, and this may be question of being the victim of your own success because you've done so well with early voting in our state and federal elections. You know, this has something that we think we can and should expand in municipal elections. And I know I don't have to tell you gentlemen or the folks in your department the challenges we have when it comes to turnout and participation in any election, but particularly in our municipal elections, particularly in our non-mayoral years. And because we've found in other elections, whether it was the state general election this past November, the presidential in 2016, providing more opportunities for eligible residents to cast their votes increases turnout. It provides people with more options to have their voice heard, to participate in our democracy, and that's what we're looking to do here. So I certainly am excited to work on this. This bill came about through conversations I had with officials in Cambridge, with the vice mayor and the mayor over there, and they have actually already sent up a version for Cambridge of this home rule petition to the State House. People are working on this. And there are other bills up at the State House looking at making it statewide to give cities and towns options to opt into this, and that would be great. But I want to make sure that Boston is leading on this, as we have on so many important issues, as you and your department and the men and women who you work with have done such a great job of administering early voting. In our state and federal elections, this is an opportunity to continue moving forward, to making sure that everyone who's eligible has an opportunity to vote. We're all going to be up on the ballot in a few months, and 2 years after that, we'll have another mayoral election, another city council election, and this is so important that we give everyone the opportunity. So I look forward to hearing your suggestions and comments on how we can make this legislation as effective as possible, as easy to implement as possible, and what else we need to do here as a city council in the city of Boston to get this done. And again, I want to thank the chairman for working with us to hold this hearing quickly and put it together, and obviously really feel privileged to have support from my colleagues and of course our co-sponsor, Councilor Janey.
Thank you, Councilor Zakem. Chair recognizes Councilor Kim Janey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first, I'd just really like to acknowledge and thank my colleague, Councilor Zakem, for his leadership on these issues. Certainly the Elections Department for the work that you do every day, all of the advocates who have been working with us around this important issue. As Councilor Zakem has already noted, it's so important that we make sure that our elections are easy, that they are accessible to the residents of our city. If we look at what is happening nationally, we see voter suppression in other parts of our country, and it's important that Boston be a leader on this front. We've already had some success with state early voting with our state elections, and I think it's high time that we look at our city elections. So I'd like to just get right in it. So I will keep my remarks brief and go back to the chair.
Thank you,
to open it
Councilor
up.
Janey. We're also joined by our colleague, City Councilor Matt O'Malley, and I have in my hands a letter here that Council President Andrea Campbell would like to have read into the record, which says, "Dear Council Flaherty, I regret to inform you that I'm unable to attend today's hearing on docket 0130, petition for a special law regarding an act authorizing the City of Boston to offer early voting in municipal elections. I am proud to work with my colleagues, Councilor Janey and Zakem, to co-sponsor this ordinance. Unfortunately, I have a long-standing conflict and cannot attend the hearing. I look forward to working with my colleagues and the advocates on passage of this important legislation. Sincerely, Andrea Campbell, President of the Boston City Council." Councilor Flynn, have any opening comments?
Yes, thank you, Councilor Flaherty, and I just want to say thank you to Councilor Janey for her work on this issue, and Councilor Zakem, who's also the chair of the Civil Rights Committee. I'm the vice chair, so I enjoy working with Councilor Zakem. This is certainly a civil rights issue, in my opinion. And what I'd like to hear or focus on is what impact would early voting have on the disabled? What type of outreach could we have to ensure that those in the disability community have the same access to early voting as every voter? And the other issue I would like to hear more information on is what impact would this have on, or how could we include veterans that are serving overseas? Often it's difficult to get an absentee ballot to someone overseas, but maybe with early voting, we could give them enough time to get that ballot mailed out to them. I do know that the federal government does have an opportunity for veterans to even vote by email. But I would like to learn more about any plans you might have on how this could assist veterans and how this could also assist those in the disability community. And I just want to say thank you for your leadership on this issue, Commissioner. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn. Any opening comments? Councilor Matt O'Malley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Commissioner and Registrar. One of my favorite podcasts was with you two on my podcast talking about how we ought to make it easier, not harder, for folks to vote, and this goes right into that. Thank you to the sponsors, Councilor Zakem, who has been working on this for quite some time, and Councilor Janey. Just very, very briefly, I absolutely support this. We ought to have early voting for every election. I'm talking about not presidentials, midterms, municipals, even special elections. It is a proven success that works. And if you look back to the state primary election this year, or last year, in early September of 2018, it's the day after Labor Day. Most of us thought the turnout would be very, very low. It wasn't. And there is sort of an awakened civic activism, not only in Boston, not only in the Commonwealth, but across the country. And anything we can do to make it easier for folks to vote earlier is a step in the right direction. It's going to cost money. There's no question about it. But I would argue that it is among the most important expenditures that we should be making as we talk about the budget this year. Make sure we allocate the several $100,000 or $1 million, whatever it would cost, to have a fully operational early voting system in the city of Boston. And I know it's going to, another concern may be taxing your staff, Commissioner. I get that. Again, I would argue that this is so important, we ought to be hiring more staff for you to make sure that this can be implemented and implemented well. So I am so excited to have this opportunity. I really appreciate, Mr. Chairman, your calling this hearing early so that we can hopefully get this done by the municipal elections this fall. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. Well, welcome to both the Commissioner and the Registrar. If you please state your name and title and affiliation for the record, and you guys have the floor to tell us your thoughts on this.
Thanks. Good morning. My name is Dion Irish, Commissioner of the Boston Election Department.
Sabino Piemonte, and I'm the Head Assistant Registrar for the City of Boston Election Department.
So thank you, Chairman Flaherty and Councilor Zakem, Janey, Flynn, and O'Malley. It's always a pleasure to work along with you, and we certainly appreciate the opportunity to testify today at this hearing. Before I get into this testimony, I'd like to take this opportunity just to thank two employees for the department who recently retired, and they provided over 100 years combined of service to the city of Boston. So I'd like to congratulate Anna Kazar and Agnes Hurley on their recent retirements. With respect to early voting, we're big supporters. Mayor Walsh is a big supporter of early voting, and as you mentioned, we're all in favor of making things easier for voters, and we're willing to make whatever sacrifices that we need to do on our side just to make it convenient, because we understand what our job is all about. I'm sure you guys have all gotten feedback from voters, as well as myself and the mayor. I've gotten emails, phone calls, just in-person comments from voters, how happy they were with the added convenience that early voting provided them. And the numbers back it up. In 2018, we had about 28,000 people vote early. And our first go-around in 2016, which was the presidential election, we had 50,000 people vote early. So we're very happy with the participation that we're seeing. So we're in support. There are some things that we want to bring to your attention, and they're relative to timeline. One is that the municipal election cycle is more of a condensed timeline than the other cycles that we've had early voting in. Our municipal preliminary election is later in September, so we do have a shorter window between both elections, and but we think that we could make necessary adjustments for that. I think the major thing that I want to bring to your attention is that I think currently this proposal calls for it to be effective immediate upon passage, but we will need lead time should we want to implement it for 2019. We'd need at least 6 months in order to secure locations and make the logistical preparations in order to administer early voting for this election year. With respect to how this would impact veterans of military serving overseas, Sabino, feel free to join in, but I do think that the absentee process would probably be better suited for folks who are overseas, because we will have absentee ballots earlier than we would have early voting ballots.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And but with respect to veterans who are here, I think we can continue to improve and do more outreach to groups who are here to make sure that they understand the early voting and the absentee opportunities that are available to everyone. With respect to folks with disabilities, we're continually working with our Commission for Persons with Disabilities. In fact, Commissioner McCaw, she's on our Election Advisory Committee, so that we're constantly just getting input and advice and making sure we're making the right connections to educate folks that there's opportunities available to them. And on the administration side, we've made it a priority to make sure our poll workers understand how we can properly serve voters with disabilities. We even created a video that we air in each training now that Commissioner McCosh actually stars in the video, where we're continually giving them information. It's a big part of our training, and we've also encouraged some of our poll workers to volunteer to be what we call accessibility ambassadors, where we give them enhanced training. And in addition to that, we're all familiar with the equipment that we have available at every polling place to serve voters with disabilities. In addition, and that's also available for folks at all of our early voting sites. So I think I'll leave it there for now, and we're prepared to answer any questions that you may have.
Well, thank you both, Dion and Sabino. As you know, the council has worked very closely over the years with the Election Commission. I led the efforts on behalf of the council with the transliteration of ballots at that time, just trying to do the implementation of the rollout, working cooperatively with your predecessor. I know Sabino has had a front row seat for the transliteration of ballots piece. So we've always had this good, positive working relationship. So I'm confident that with respect to getting this off the ground and implementing this proposal, the early voting, we'll get it done as quickly as we can and get it turned around as quickly as possible. And food for thought in the event that there happens to be a special election between sort of now and then, maybe it's possible we could do a pilot, to at least work out the kinks on that particular election. There's not one right now, but in the event that there is either a municipal or a state special, I'll just throw out food for thought that in the event that there is a vacancy or there is a special, may make sense to maybe get our hands around potentially just doing a quick pilot on that election if that's possible within your department. So With respect to the questions on your testimony, does the election department currently, do they have the ability with its current staffing to implement this if it was to happen tomorrow?
If it was passed tomorrow, yes.
Okay.
That would give us sufficient lead time to prepare, and particularly like early on this year, we're already securing polling places for election day, so we'd need to secure locations for early voting sites. We'd need to start securing poll workers, identifying training sites and dates, and just logistical things. But with the staff that we have now, we would be able to accomplish this given enough time to prepare.
And what would the estimated cost of doing the early voting in Boston for municipal election, what would that be? Any idea?
It would be about $380,000.
380?
Yes.
And then citywide, are we talking like, one seat per ward, or, so I guess how many polling locations that is? So what do you envision for early voting polling locations across the city? Is it going to be done by ward or by precinct, or?
So first of all, the number I just gave you, that's just for one early voting election, right? So that wouldn't, if we had multiple, it'd be, multiplied by that amount. Now,
And that doesn't matter if it's a district or an at-large or so like it's 380,000 citywide to conduct an early voting citywide.
Citywide. So if it was just one district, it would be a lot less.
Yeah.
Yes. In terms of how we approach siting for early voting, we look at city council districts. We also look at neighborhoods, and we put together schedules that offer early voting location opportunity either in or very close to every single neighborhood of the city. And we try to make sure that it's as equitable as possible.
Right, and obviously equity is going to be key, and then also making sure that there's no voter fraud as well. How we're going to protect ourselves from that. Absolutely,
that's the reason why we implemented electronic poll books that we use for checking in voters. They're interconnected, and so when someone goes to one early voting site and votes, we know that's recorded at every single site. So there's no ability for someone to go and vote twice.
And how many days in advance do you envision early voting taking place in Boston before the election?
Well, given the way this is written now, it would be similar to what we currently have for the state election. So it would be, I think, 11 days prior to election day. It would end the Friday before the Tuesday election in November.
And then that specific polling location would be staffed or manned throughout the entire 11 days.
City Hall would, for every weekday, every day during the week, we typically offer early voting here at City Hall.
Here at the building.
And then last go around, we had a Tuesday, Thursday schedule where we were out in the neighborhood at different parts of the city on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And on Saturday and Sunday, we were in every council district. We had one location in each district that were open on Saturday and Sunday from 10 a.m. until, I think, 6 p.m.
And how did that work from your vantage point?
It worked really well. Early voting weekend this year, we had about 8,000 people vote that weekend.
And were there any issues of note that we've learned from?
No, I think that a lot of the challenges that we have been working on are things that are not visible to the public. Just back channel things and how we process things and how we can be more efficient and effective. And I think we made a great leap from year one, which is 2016, to year two. So we're continually looking for ways that we can improve on that. And one of the things that we're looking at is how we process early voting ballots on Election Day. Because although folks are able to vote early, on Election Day, we're still sending them to each precinct, which it's still quite a challenge for the poll workers to process the in-person voters and deal with the early voting ballots. So we're looking to see if we are able to do what we call a central tabulation facility, where we could process those ballots somewhere else on Election Day and relieve our poll workers of that burden, so to speak.
That was going to be my next question in terms of how those votes are counted. So the way you're doing it now is that the early voting ballots are brought to the specific ward and precinct of that individual voter and then put into the same box or counted after or counted before they're tabbed from the machine.
Yeah, they're counted like during the day. separately. So we've trained the teams to have a person assigned, 2 people assigned to do a checkoff and on the early voting list and open the ballots and feed them through the machine as the opportunity allows itself during the day.
Very good. And then you see that changing in terms of, you see that procedure changing where you would, what would be the new method that you're exploring? Instead of having the person go out to the precinct, you're talking about what?
Yeah. So, you know, this is a good opportunity for me to also just say publicly that we for the next election, we should have new voting machines. So we're in the process of issuing a request for proposals, and we hope to have new machines that would increase capability to allow us to designate a facility as a central tabulation facility that it would be publicly available to anyone who wants to observe, and we'd have a team of maybe 40 to 50 poll workers who are just processing early voting ballots all day long at that site instead of sending them out to each precinct.
And is it possible to protect, so someone's going to early vote and they're the only one in that precinct and in that ward to early vote? Is there a way to protect that individual's identity as to who they voted for?
Early voting is similar to absentee voting, where someone, you know, you do make your choices and you insert them in an envelope, and there is information on that envelope. But when the ballots are processed, all those envelopes are opened up. We're checking off the voters' names on the list, but the ballots themselves, the poll workers are not looking at those ballots. They don't really have the time to do all of that. What they're doing is opening up all the ballots and then feeding them through the machine. Okay. So from the training that we have and the folks that we had to do the work for us, we're very confident that votes are confidential as they can be with that type of process.
Very good. Yeah, and the concern will be in an off-year municipal election where the turnout is significantly lower. You may have situations where there's only like 1 or 2 people from a specific precinct that are going to participate in early voting, and thereby folks may know who they vote for. So as long as the safeguards are there to protect that individual's privacy.
As long as there's other votes being cast in that precinct, all the results will be tabulated together. So for instance, the early voting central tabulation site are not going to be results released separately from the actual election day results.
Very good. Thank you. Chair recognizes Councilor Zachem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, Chairman had somewhat of an exhaustive first go, so I think I can keep my questions pretty brief. First, acknowledging that we have dates now set for the 2019 election. I know when Councilor Janey and I were putting this together, that was the goal, and it still is the goal, I think, but I want to acknowledge the fact that although this body and the mayor can act swiftly on these up on Beacon Hill, these things can sometimes languish, and I want to make sure we do have enough time. So stating that the goal here is still to have this in place if we can get this through this building and up to Beacon Hill for the upcoming elections, but inserting some language in the bill that would say, you know, for the next municipal election after enactment of this legislation, to sort of address that issue, because I want to be realistic and make sure you and the folks that work in your department have time to get this set up, I think is something we can do to address that. And then when you talked about the cost of being $380,000, that's what was for in November, what we had for citywide early voting. Is that what that is based on?
That's based on our projection for what it would cost for 2019. For city elections, we actually do our own printing, so there's a little difference in the cost. State elections, the state prints the ballots for us.
And so that's a somewhat increased cost?
Yes.
Yeah. And does it matter, is it a factor in the issue, even with early voting, we're likely to see lower turnout in a municipal election than in, say, the 2020 presidential election? Does that have a significant impact on cost?
No. That would not impact the cost because we still prepare the same, we'd still order the same number of ballots and hire the same number of staff with the expectation that we'd have the same type of turnout.
Excellent. Well, I think my goal here and what I would like to do as quickly as we can, you know, with the chairman, with your support, with our colleagues, and ultimately, obviously, with the mayor, is get a version of this bill through this council up to Beacon Hill to work as fast as we can. And like I said, acknowledging that they can be very slow up there, particularly in acting on some of our home rule petitions. But But this is an easy step that needs to be done, and I appreciate both of you coming in with that attitude, which is really important, that we're all on the same page here of trying to make these improvements and trying to get the word out to residents of the city of Boston that this is going to be an easier opportunity for them to participate in elections. And I do, in the legislation, we intentionally gave quite a bit of discretion to the Election Commission and how this is going to operate, because we want this to work. We don't want to be overly prescriptive, but we're looking to get the authorization from the state for the city council, for your body to get this in place. So that's it. I think I want to thank the chairman for asking so many of the detailed questions that I had earlier, and I look forward to getting this done. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Zakem. I've also been joined by my colleague, City Councilor Anissa Asabi-George, and my colleague, City Councilor Mark Siomo. Chair recognizes City Councilor Kim Janey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So with the $380,000 projected costs for citywide voting in a municipal race, that takes into account this central tabulation facility?
Actually, that does not.
So could we potentially be looking at more cost?
Potentially.
Yeah. And when we're talking about that $380,000, could you break, like, how much of that is staffing versus ballots versus, could you just give a overview or breakdown of that money?
Based upon what we did this past state election, the majority of the cost is more the advertisement and letting people know what's happening, where they're happening, with the mailing that we did across the whole city. And I guess post office costs are extremely high. Printing of the flyers themselves, that came out to a total of approximately $170,000. That's postage, mailings, and any kind of other additional advertisements that we did. The part of poll work is we assume it's going to be in the same 40 locations that we used this past state election, and we came up with the cost of $82,000 just for poll workers during that 2-week early voting period. Printing costs could be in the vicinity of $40,000 to $50,000, depends on how many registered voters we have and how many ballots we seem that we need to order. We based it on a 30% turnout for early voting, and that's where we came up with that cost. And there are some, rental of additional vehicles to transport all the equipment out to all of these early voting sites, miscellaneous supplies, some programming costs, and so on and so forth. And that's how we come up with that cost of $380,000.
Is there a projected cost for the actual central tabulation facility?
It's about $15,000, give or take, depending on how many ballots have to be processed and how many stations we're actually going to house during that central tabulation facility.
So we could be looking at 400,000, let's say.
Yeah.
If we're including that. Of the 80,000 for poll workers, how much of that is for training? Is there training included in here?
That's all inclusive with training as well.
Wonderful. And we talk about 40 locations. That's for the city of Boston, what you did for the state elections, yes? And how do you ensure that, you mentioned equity, Commissioner, how do you ensure that they're kind of placed throughout the city in a way that makes sure that all the council districts are covered, that I assume they all have to be ADA compliant, yes?
Yes.
And so what are you looking at in terms of making sure that there's equity and accessibility, and not just ADA compliant, but that they're, close to the T, that they have parking? Like, what are the things that you're looking at?
You sort of mentioned some of them, that they're ADA compliant, that we're looking at locations that are accessible by public transportation, that they have parking, that are in the midst of neighborhoods so they're walkable. We're looking at the city geographically to make sure that we're in every part of the city, but we're also looking at the city by neighborhood and council districts. So there are many filters. For example, if you just looked at District 2, for example, just having a polling place for early voting in District 2 without acknowledging, South Boston and Chinatown and different parts, the north, different parts of different districts is important. So we look at all of that as well. And ultimately, we put together a draft when we put it out for community feedback, public feedback, elected official feedback, and then from there we go on to a final schedule.
Okay, assuming that this passes, At what point in time do you do that? So what's the timeline to putting out a list of here are the 40 sites that we're thinking about and trying to engage the public to get feedback? Let's say this was passed today.
Yeah. So actually, I'm thinking for 2018, I think we put it out in about February. We began putting out drafts.
And who are the groups that you put it out to for feedback?
Groups that are on our election advisory committee, that includes Mass Votes, the Chinese Progressive Association, Viet Aid, the Rocks Vote Coalition, ABCD, those folks, and from there we sent it out. We sent it out to every city councilor and community organizations.
Yes. Thank you. And when you send information out, I assume in all languages? Or which languages?
In terms of the draft of the proposal,
Yeah.
that's pretty much sent out in English.
So if you were, let's say, sending stuff out to CPA, the Chinese Progressive, you mentioned District 2, is there information going out, or are they required to then translate the information?
So actually, I mean, in terms of looking at the draft, it's in English, and the members of the Chinese Progressive Association, they're on our election advisory commission, so that there's no
engage
language
their
needed at that point.
community. Okay.
But in terms of when we do outreach, we do outreach in 11 different languages.
Okay. Could you talk a little bit about increase in participation that we've seen as we've looked at early voting in past elections?
Increase in participation.
Yes. So you mentioned for 2016, we saw 50,000 people vote early, and in the midterms last fall, we saw 28,000 people. Did you see increases in particular wards and precincts? Were some relatively flat, no change, or what? And perhaps you don't have this information with you this morning, which is fine, but I'd be interested to see in where we saw people really taking advantage of it, and where, if we didn't see a lot of people taking advantage of it, what could we do more to kind of engage folks in those communities to make sure that people know that this is an option, to hopefully increase turnout in those communities. So I don't know if you have that kind of mapping of which wards and precincts really liked early voting and took advantage of it, where there were others where we need to do more work to kind of get the word out. Do you kind of have that analysis?
Yeah, we kind of have that. So, no, the wheels are spinning when you ask that question, because in the election administration, like research world, there's a lot of conversation about whether or not early voting increases turnout, and the type of data analysis that you need to do to determine whether or not there's a statistically significant change is not something that we undertook, and is not as relevant for our purposes. But we did look at which neighborhoods did participate more in early voting than others are. I should say which precincts. And we did see a trend that in the precincts that have more voters, that precincts that we're actually trying to adjust in terms of making subdivisions, because there's so many voters and so much growth in those particular precincts. And typically there's been long lines in the past on election days before early voting. A lot of those voters from those precincts actually use early voting to, I think, avoid the lines on election day.
So people taking advantage of early voting, not necessarily increasing turnout overall, but people do want the opportunity to vote when it's convenient for them?
Yes.
Is what you're saying? Okay. Thank you.
Thank
For
you,
now.
Councilor Janey. Chair recognizes City Councilor Matt O'Malley.
Mr. Chairman, so just so folks who may be here or watching this or streaming this online know, right now, if we do nothing, the only way someone can vote in this municipal election is to vote on election day or request an absentee ballot, which anyone can do. But if they come to City Hall to vote early, legally, and this is not City of Boston law, this is not a City of Boston ordinance, it's the state. Legally, someone cannot early vote if they're going to be in the city on election day. Is that correct? Yeah. Again, just folks, this isn't our ordinance. I think everyone in this building agrees that's a ridiculous idea. So, at a minimum, what would it take, at an absolute minimum, and I'm not advocating for this because I think that having early vote sites in the community is what's crucial to success, but at a minimum, what would it take to allow for early voting because I think you had mentioned this in your remarks, through the early voting process, you can vote every day or most days during business hours at City Hall, as well as some satellite locations out in the neighborhood. So at a minimum, what would it take to allow for early voting in City Hall? As sort of remove that completely arbitrary and capricious barrier that has been set that would only allow for voting early if you're going to be away from your municipality on election day. Would that take a home rule petition as well?
I believe it would.
Okay. So,
If you're asking the question in regards to if you're going to be away from the city on election day, there is an absentee process for that. But
understood.
If you're saying early voting for anybody in City Hall, then yeah, this home rule petition is necessary.
Yes, I get that, but technically, you cannot go to City Hall and vote early under the old law or under the established state law unless you're going to be isn't under pains of penalty of perjury that you're going to be away from.
There's 3 requirements that you
there you
need.
go.
And one of them is a physical disability that prevents you from going to the polls. One is absence from the city, and one is a religious belief that you can't enter one of those buildings or you can't leave your home or whatever the case may be.
So I guess for me, it's always been maddening that I'm not minimizing those are all important reasons why you couldn't, but we should, of course, make it easier. And one thing that early voting does is it allows for it easier. So you said you need about 6 months lead time. So if we could get this passed, and then I guess this question, Mr. Chairman, through you, is to you and the maker, it would then be a home rule. But we could theoretically vote on this Wednesday. Mayor Walsh could sign it into law on Thursday, could get to the state legislature by Friday, but they would still need a legislative fix. So I guess, Mr. Chairman, through you to the maker, or through you, do we have allies set up on Beacon Hill who are set to take the lead on this?
That's our hope. We're talking to Councilor Zachem and Councilor Janey, so obviously the mayor would need to sign it as well, and through his leadership, try to get this thing expedited up at Beacon Hill for 2019. So the goal and the objective is to be ready to go for 2019 if we can get within that 6-month window that the commissioner is telling us. In the event that that's not the case, the language in here could be amended to include what the appropriate date that we would be able to get it done for.
And I guess, do you know, are other, is this happening in other municipalities, sort of concurrently?
Several,
Yeah, so in particular, Cambridge worked with us on drafting. They sent a virtually identical home rule petition at the end of last year. Their legislative delegation is working on this. I've spoken to members of the Boston delegation who are happy to work on this. And there has been a real push, and I want to give a shout out to Representative Andy Vargas of Haverhill, who has been doing a lot of work on civic engagement, voting rights, and access. So there is an appetite for this, but you know as well as I do how slow things can be up there. So we do want to work as
glacial pace
effectively as we can.
Yeah. Well, again, I don't have a question other than a statement. The benefits to early voting are too many to list. We would spend hours doing it, and we've seen it twice now, what a success it can be. And we even saw the success amidst the backdrop of a very important, very intense presidential election, and then we saw during a mid-year election, midterm election, which also had a lot of excitement and activity. That will continue. The easier we make it for folks to vote, the more participation we will see. There have been 2 perfect examples of that thus far. And the fact that this is working so well, not only in Boston, but in communities around the Commonwealth, shows a real desire. You guys can handle it. You have one of the most important jobs, and you do it so well. Your team does it so well. And I'm excited that there seems to be essentially broad-based agreement in this among the members of our body to get this done. So I am just hopeful that we can get it done for this year's election. That's the key. That is crucial. If we kick the can down the road, and I'm not saying we do it, it's more often than not going to be the legislature, but if we continue to delay this, we're going to choke this, and all the momentum that we've seen is going to be for naught. So I'm just so delighted to be here, and anything we can do to get this done as soon as humanly possible, we ought to be doing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilor O'Malley. Chair recognizes City Councilor Anissa Asabi George.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councilors Janey and Zachem, for your work on this. Would, if we weren't able, as Councilor O'Malley said, to move this along, speed it Would it be available for both the preliminaries and the finals this coming year, for September and November?
As I understand, this proposal is for the, to do it in similar fashion to what happens for the state election, which is prior to the November election.
So prior to the general, it doesn't impact the preliminary or the primary, or any primary?
Yes.
And the costs, as you outlined, I think that detail is very helpful, and we appreciate the expense of the need to do this and all of that. But I would imagine if this were to become regular practice and we were to do this going forward, that the cost would, over time, be decreased substantially as it became standard practice. True. I mean, I think that we're going to experience some upfront advertising costs, no doubt, but over the long term, even in the midterm, we would find it not being so expensive to do this.
No, I believe over time there is an opportunity to decrease costs. We've already seen a decrease in costs from 2016 to 2018 in terms of acquiring the hardware, the electronic poll books, and things of that nature. We already have those things now. In terms of the advertising piece of our budget, as early voting becomes a part of our voting culture, I think that there'll be less of a need to maybe spend as much as we are doing now. So, you know, I think that's something that we can keep an eye on.
All right. So just for clarification for me, this is not for a preliminary or a primary, it's just for the general election? Perhaps this is a question through the chair to the makers. It's just for the final, for any November election as opposed to a September preliminary primary?
Which is how it works for the state currently.
Very good, thank you.
That's how it's written.
Thank you.
And that's how it how it works with the state.
Thank you, Councilor Sabi George. Chair recognizes City Councilor Mark Siomo. Appreciate your patience.
Going to the dentist.
Anyway, I'll talk loud. The 380,000, obviously, I'm glad you asked that question, Councilor Sabi George. I thought that we did do it in the primaries. We didn't do early voting in the primaries. It was just in the general. Okay, so the 380,000 is just for that early voting 2 weeks prior to the November election.
Yes.
Right. And I think you answered this question earlier, but you haven't really kind of crunched the numbers on, like, have we seen an increase overall kind of, you know, apples to apples? You know, an off year would be, the last election would have been 15, for example. Or we didn't do it in 15, but we're going to, going forward, if we do this, we're going to look at the effect on turnout and what percentage of the total vote is early versus final.
Yeah. So in 2016, about 17% of the overall vote was early vote. In 2018, about just almost 13% of the overall vote was early voting.
Right.
In terms of the research that I've done and with folks who have looked at early voting throughout the country, there is no clear indication that you can actually tie early voting to increase in turnout. And it's also more difficult to do that because when you consider that the universe of voters changes over time. In 2016, for example, we had many more voters than we did the year prior to that. We had over 400,000 voters. Right. I think it was about 415,000 voters. So when you have more voters added to the rolls, that affects the turnout percentage. But in fact, we may have had more voters vote in that election than the previous election. So there's some statistical things that you'd have to look at. But the way we've always approached it is to make sure that we're making it as convenient as possible, that we're educating the public, they know our schedule and that that's available to them. And we're looking at the numbers of people who turn out at the sites and what's effective, what's not effective. And that's why we made changes from 2016 to 2018, because we looked at the numbers and the average, we had about 200 voters per hour, and we had long lines almost all the time in 2016. And we realized that we needed a bigger window of time. We need spaces that accommodated more people, more voting booths, more people at the check-in table. So we did that in 2018, and that worked immensely, where folks could literally walk in and out, having voted in about 10, 15 minutes.
And I did vote early. It was greatly convenient. There was a lot of people that availed themselves of that. 2016, to your point, there was huge lines out those early voting polls. So I'm glad to hear that you're kind of crunching those numbers and trying to make it less cumbersome to vote presidential years. So thank you guys for the work that you do and your whole department.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I just want to add one more thing. The other thing that we realized with early voting is that although it may not increase, we can't say that it increased the number of voters. We know that it's convenient to a lot of voters who previously didn't have as many options in how to cast their ballot, whether it be public safety folks in the medical field, folks who are working on a campaign, and folks who maybe have two jobs. And I always like to use my mother, for example. She doesn't work two jobs, but because of her commute and the hours that she works, she literally has like maybe a 1 hour window at the end of the day to get to her polling place.
Right. Thank you again. Thanks.
Very good. Any additional questions of this panel from my colleagues before we move on to the second panel? Follow-up question from Councilor Janey.
Yes. So thank you. I just want to echo what Councilor O'Malley was saying around kind of the early voting at City Hall, like that people should not have to travel out of town or have a doctor's appointment or whatever reason they may have. They should just be able to go and vote. I'm wondering what kind of supports, I think in addition to the categories that you mentioned, poll workers have a hard time voting on Election Day, particularly if they're working a poll that is not their own poll. What kind of accommodations are given to them currently, if anything?
Currently, they get like a 2-hour break to go to their polling place to vote.
Yeah.
But early voting does help them tremendously.
Exactly. Well, thank you. I think
Sure,
that's
and
it for me.
thank you, Councilor Janey. And a follow-up on that, so for college kids who are here or who are traveling, those that are out of state, probably most typically will do an absentee ballot. But those that are either in-state or maybe just over state lines that tend to maybe come back for Election Day, in the event that they're not able to come back on that Tuesday because of a school day, they would probably tend to come in the Saturday before the election. And to Councilor Janey's point, if they don't have the doctor's appointment, or they'd probably be encouraged to do absentee, but at that point, the weekend before the election, it's almost too late. So,
And even
I
early
guess,
voting,
so I would
it's
say
too
then
late.
that same token, that if you have a City of Boston resident who's a college kid who's coming in on a Saturday to vote before the Tuesday because they're going to be stuck in class, I think that they should be allowed to do that without having to go through the formal, I guess, absentee process.
One last question. And have we talked about expanding the window for absentee voting at all? So to Councilor Flynn's point around vets, people, men and women who are in service somewhere else, or college students, are we thinking about expanding? Have we ever had that conversation about expanding the window for casting an absentee ballot?
Well, absentee ballots are cast pretty much as soon as we receive the absentee ballots. So if the election, this past election cycle was September 4th, we had ballots within 2 weeks in our possession to be mailed out to anyone. So it didn't interfere with the early voting schedule,
Right.
which is 2
But how
weeks
early
prior.
are they available? Is
As soon as
it
they-
a wide enough window, I guess, is my question.
Well, the wide enough window is the day that the election gets certified from the primary and ballots are produced, and once we receive them, they're in the mail.
They're available.
So it could be within a week to 10 days that we do receive them, but it's all in regards to finalizing the election, ballots being printed and delivered to each community.
Perfect, very good. So thank you very much to Commissioner Dion Irish and to
Thank you.
Registrar Sabino Piemonte. I appreciate your time and attention. We're going to go to the second panel. Ask that maybe you stick around. I expect it'll probably be a pretty brief panel, but as a courtesy to those that have been waiting. So I know that Jonathan Cohn is here, and also George Pillsbury, and I know
He's
Cheryl
not
Crawford
here.
is not here. So I don't see Cheryl, and I don't see George.
Cheryl's not able to make it, George is not here.
So if Jonathan Cohn, co-chair of the Issues Committee of the
Oh.
Progressive
And this
Massachusetts,
gentleman who's with Jen. We'll just introduce us.
and the gentleman that's with him, if you guys can come right down here. Yep. That's fine. Perfect, great. Come on down, welcome.
Come on down.
You can just open that up. You got it?
Or jump over it.
Yeah, there you go.
And you're welcome to stay here, or if you want to go into the audience, it's entirely up to you, wherever you're most comfortable with, the Commissioner and the Registrar. So welcome, Jonathan, and if you could state your name and affiliation for the record.
Yes, Ian from Mass Vote.
Ian from Mass Vote, so welcome, Jonathan and Ian. If you could just introduce yourselves for the record and your affiliation, you have the floor to discuss this matter.
Yeah, name is Jonathan Cohn. I'm the chair of the Issues Committee with Progressive Massachusetts. Like Mass Vote, we're part of the Election Modernization Coalition. I can just go. First of all, I'll thank Councilors Zakim and Janey for calling this hearing, as well as thank Councilor Flaherty, O'Malley, and Asabi George, and formerly Flynn and Siomo, who are here. My name is Jonathan Cohn. I chair the Issues Committee with Progressive Massachusetts. We're a statewide grassroots organization committed to issues like shared prosperity, racial and social justice, sustainable infrastructure, environmental protection, and good government and strong democracy. And there's no better way to strengthen our democracy than to increase the accessibility of voting. There are many factors that determine whether or not an eligible voter will participate in an election. The difficulty that an individual faces when attempting to vote is certainly one of them. Individuals in our highly unequal city have busy lives, dividing their day between going to work or school, caring for children or other loved ones, running errands, and countless other tasks. When voters can only cast their ballots over the course of 11 hours on one day, a Tuesday in the middle of the school and work week, the trade-offs can be high. For people have long commutes, take night classes after work, or juggle multiple jobs, and caring for children or other family members certainly counts as a job, that narrow window can be prohibitive. Tuesday elections are a vestige of the rural society that the United States once was, and fortunately, states across the country have been modernizing their election administration. Here in Massachusetts, back in 2014, the legislature passed and Governor Deval Patrick signed an election modernization package that brought early voting to Massachusetts, as well as other vital reforms like, let's say, pre-registration, et cetera, that we, as well as Mass Vote, and kind of groups like the League of Women Voters, MassPerg, and others were a part of that effort. Early voting was noted, first offered in 2016. In the presidential year, about 1 in every 6 voters voted early, and last year about 1 in every 8. These were the only elections for which it was offered, leaving out municipal elections as well as primaries. It's worked smoothly and should be expanded. The benefits of early voting are clear. As the Brennan Center for Justice notes, early voting means reduced stress on the voting system on Election Day, shorter lines on Election Day, improved poll worker performance, early identification and correction of registration errors and voter system glitches, and increased voter satisfaction. I'll note one of the points that no-fault absentee voting came up. That's common practice in the majority of states. So we are in the minority and not making it so that you kind of are supposed to be out of state in order to vote absentee, whereas I know, thinking of states nearby us, both Vermont and Maine have no-fault absentee, and going a little bit south, but still in the Northeast, New Jersey and Maryland. And even like allowing people to vote by mail in general is something that does increase turnout. Although, like, California takes forever to count votes, but that's a different issue. So given the obstacles that individuals face when trying to vote, the experiences that they have when voting play a large role in shaping their future voting patterns. And it's up to us to ensure that those experiences are positive ones. Early voting helps to do just that. So expanding this important reform to include municipal elections is a sensible next step that benefits first-time voters, returning voters, poll workers, and everyone who cares about the vibrance of our democracy.
Thank you, Jonathan, for your
Thank you.
testimony. Appreciate it. And Ian, if you could state your full name and affiliation for the record, and you have the floor.
Yes, so.
We handle it. Yeah.
Yeah, you handle it. All right, there we go. I'm Ian Key. I'm the policy director over at Mass Vote. I apologize. I was just notified last minute by Cheryl Crawford of being here, and Jonathan took my Brennan Center quote. So, yeah, Jonathan pretty much sums it up. Obviously, Massachusetts is being looked at continually, time and time again, as being that leader in modern-day elections. We are very much behind, unfortunately, but the city does have a good leadership role, and we are molding in the State House at that level, but it's definitely up to the city to promote these ideals so that not only can we be helpful at the local level, but also this can get attention at the federal level especially. So, thank you.
Good.
Yes,
Thank
ma'am.
you, Ian, for your testimony. And
Yeah, just to
Jonathan.
build off that one thing, one thing that was noted earlier was about how the precincts where early voting was the most popular were the ones that were overly large precincts in the city. And it reminded me of one thing that Mass Vote has worked on is the re-precincting of the city of Boston, which is something that has routinely hits roadblocks in the legislature, even though designing it so that you have more sensibly sized precincts is kind of intuitive, I would say, sensible. But early voting is something that can help mitigate, until that happens, early voting can help mitigate that problem by making sure that precincts, I know that Ward 5 Precinct 1, which I don't live too far from, which is Chinatown, downtown Bay Village in the South End, and it's the largest one in the city, help making sure that people who live in such precincts where it's often sometimes even far for them to get to their voting location because of how large it is, gives them a better opportunity.
Thank you, Jonathan. Great point on the re-precincting. Appreciate that. Any questions of this panel from my colleagues? Councilor Zakem?
I have, but go ahead. If you want to keep the queue, but I do.
Keep our order. I'll be brief. I want to thank you both for being here, for your organization's support, and Jonathan, I've had the opportunity to work with you on a lot of these issues over the last couple of years, and you've been a great resource, so I appreciate that, and thank you for making the time to be here. It's nice and somewhat unusual, as my colleagues can agree, to have everyone up here generally in agreement on what we want to do with a piece of legislation. And I guess, my questions, and you did touch on re-precincting being a very practical, important issue, and I know some of the members of our Boston delegation, Representative Michaelwitz, Representative Livingstone, and others are working very hard on that at the State House. But what we would see, and you're talking about your position with Progressive Mass, which is a statewide organization, Mass Vote, statewide organization. How important does it seem to be able to go either to the legislature or to other cities and towns and say Boston is doing this or is trying to do this as sort of a motivator, I guess, for lack of a better word? I think we want to do this for ourselves here in the city of Boston, but also if we can help encourage, whether it's the Commonwealth as a whole or other cities and towns, to make democracy more accessible, that's important. Have you found it to be useful in the past, or your activist membership doing things like that?
I would say yes, insofar as you have, whenever people are able to pilot any type of new policy idea, it has the benefits of any kinks being worked out early and any best practices that can be shared with other cities and towns, and since that always helps to mitigate any potentially well-meaning or unfounded concerns that people have ahead of time, so that it can be scaled up better.
And I would just, one last thing I'd say, since we are all in agreement on this, and I think we're going to be working very hard in this committee and in this body to get this legislation up to the State House, I would just ask you and your organizations to join in that lobbying effort. I know you have extensive legislative agendas, all issues that need to be addressed, whether it's voting specific or some of the other progressive issues. But as we all know, getting things through the State House, even when they're somewhat non-controversial, can be tough. So I would, just like you're here today, it would be hugely helpful in that effort.
And Councilor Zakem, you've said the point, do people look to Boston for this information, piloting, stuff like that? Absolutely. Election day registration is our priority legislation for this session. And every time I go into the small town offices, mid-sized town, reps, they all ask, what's Boston doing? And Commissioner Irish actually spoke with us, gave us great information on his proposals. So we do have that detailed information. So, just so you know, our voice counts here very much in Boston.
That is very good to hear. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very good. Councilor Janey?
Yes, thank you. So I failed to mention in my opening that I'm a founding board member of Mass Vote, so big fan. Thank you for being here in Cheryl's absence, and I appreciate all the work that you're doing at the state level, or that we're doing at the state level, as well as the municipal level. Thank you for being here. Jonathan, thank you for all the work, not just at Progressive Mass, but you failed to mention that you're chair
Yeah.
of the Ward 4 Democratic Committee, and you're doing amazing work there to really engage residents of Ward 4 in this process. And so thank you for all of that. If either of you have any ideas or suggestions that weren't already mentioned, or ones that you kind of want to just co-sign on in terms of how the city can do better to encourage early voting when we do have it. We currently don't have it at the municipal level yet, but whatever suggestions that you may have, we're open to hear. And then I have another question for the administration, which I'll just ask right now. In terms of provisional ballots, did we see an increase in the number of provisional ballots? Was there a larger proportion of the early voting ballots that were counted as provisional ballots, or was it pretty much, did it stay the same with what we usually see for provisional ballots? Was that clear? I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Got that? All right.
provisional ballots on early voting days are very minimal.
Okay.
Most of the problems that we see on early voting days is people that have requested an absentee ballot, and we have a process in place to try to cover our tracks and make sure people are not voting twice.
Right. With the,
Our electronic poll books will indicate to the poll workers whether someone requested it, returned the ballot, and whatever the case may be, and we have a procedure for that. But on election day, I do not think, and I didn't look at this in much detail, provisional ballots was high, but not as high as a presidential election.
okay. Thank you.
And most of those are because people were not registered at the correct location where they went to vote.
Okay, thank you. That's good to know. And if there are any ideas that you have for us or the administration that's here, just around how we can encourage more participation, certainly, I'm sure we all want to hear those ideas if you have any. No pressure. If none, that's great.
One thing I was putting a good word for that. One thing that had a hearing, I know there was a hearing order for last year that I thought that I would love to see the council take up this year, was the idea of having landlords provide voter registration information to tenants. That I believe Seattle did that recently, and I believe it's Minneapolis is one of the other cities that have done that recently, since the city already requires certain information to be as part of like a package when you sign a lease. That it's kind of that extra step is fairly low, and it's something that, since it reduces another barrier of somebody seeking out the information, could help increase registration rates.
Excellent.
And,
Thank you.
and to that point, Mr. Chairman, that was a hearing where I filed last year with Councilors Edwards and now former Councilor Presley, and something we're certainly going to pursue again. But thank you for the reminder, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Councilor Matt O'Malley. Any questions of this panel?
No questions, just gentlemen, want to thank you both for your advocacy and being a great organization that have been doing yeoman's work in the trenches for years.
I don't need to be redundant in this. This is something that we really ought to be doing. We all agree. I cannot for the life of me think of where the opposition would come from, other than perhaps people entrenched in power who don't want more people to participate in their civic duty. So I think that the time is right to do it now. Thank you all. We will certainly be looking to continuing to work with you and partner with you at the state level, as it seems that may be a little bit more difficult to navigate than perhaps the city. But just want to thank the makers and thank all four of you gentlemen for your great work in this. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you. And then through the chair, are there any questions that the Commissioner Registrar have of our panel guest, or our panel guest have of our Commissioner while we're here? Very good. Thank you. So that'll conclude, well, actually, you know what, there is an opportunity for public testimony. I know that Sarah Gifford had signed in, did not want to testify, but if there are any members of the public that are here that wish to offer public testimony at this time, may do so, or forever hold your peace. Seeing and hearing no desire for any additional public testimony, that will conclude the public testimony portion. And by way of wrap-up, I guess the goal here will be to try to get some stuff turned around through the committee, get something before the council for a vote, get something over to Commissioner Registrar through the administration for a signature, get it up to Beacon Hill, and then you guys can help maybe work the phones as well, try to get some expedited action as requested by our colleague here, Councilor Matt O'Malley. And then in the short term, look at these, the no-fault absentee in the short term, and Anything else we had to shut, no fault, and that was it, I think it, so, very good. So that will conclude today's hearing in the Community and Government Operations with respect to docket 0130, petition for a special law and act authorizing the city of Boston to offer early voting in municipal elections. Appreciate everyone's time and attention and your testimony, and look forward to working with you as we move forward. Thank you.